I want to start off by noting that Stefan Brüggemann's work over the last 2 decades is denominated by one major and perhaps defining orientation: a critical, historically informed, often humorous, sometimes tendentious, conceptually and materially innovative relation to language. Now, many in his and recent generations have privileged the use of words and language, including artists associated with conceptual art, such as Joseph Kosuth, Hannah Darboven, Lawrence Weiner, John Baldessari, Robert Barry. A couple of works from Robert Barry here. It's true also that language was key to the articulations of institutional critique in the differently formatted work of Hans Haacke here and Marcel Brutaz, La Salle Blanche from 1975, and others. And this relationship was reinvigorated again in the movements following on, including what I would want to describe as New York postmodernism, especially in the work of Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer. Truisms, a bronze plaque from the Living series, her Truisms t-shirts along with Stefan's, and of course the presence in the center of New York City in Times Square on the Spectacolor board. And finally, these relationships and tussles with language have characterized more recent US and West Coast art, including work by Mike Kelly, Raymond Pettibon, Christopher Wool, Francis Stark, to name just a few. So within this broad constellation, many artist wordsmiths are identified with a consistent style of language and/or its deployment and appearance. Kruger, for example, has used similar fonts, a signature range of colors and designs, and a consistent modulation of phrasing and address throughout her long career. Within this busy spectrum of language interests and uses, several things, I think, set Brüggemann's oeuvre apart. First, the sheer range of formats, materializations, and outcomes that he mobilizes at the interface of art and language. Secondly, the richness of his unstinting dialogue with the protocols of the word-image two-step. And thirdly, his complex enmeshment in the modernist genealogy of language usage in art, going back to the founding movements of the earlier 20th century, especially, as we'll see in a minute, Cubism. So I want to share some thoughts this afternoon that pose Brüggemann's work in relation to historical and conceptual frameworks for the deployment of text in, on, and around an artwork, in order to reflect a little on how he has navigated through a discursive arena characterized by a thrillingly diverse assemblage of language types and forms, social, material, technological, that encompasses signatures, inscriptions, collage, typography, billboards, placards, posters, graffiti, stickers, labels, neon signage, LED displays, as well as more recent virtual realizations of language. Or, imagined another way, I want to ask how Brüggemann activates the dispositions of language through the space and in the presence of the artwork, a project that opens onto linguistically inflected questions of mood, tense, injunction, abbreviation, address, and punctuation, that takes stock of the formal, tactile, and oral qualities of language as sound, shape, and substance, and raises a torrent of philosophical and political issues framed by the stakes of denomination, definition, order, and reference, as well as, and knowingly it would seem, taking up with what lies on the other side of language, a propositional uncanny, if you like, or more simply, the pervasive subtexts of speech and writing. Now, there isn't time this afternoon to itemize, let alone annotate, the signal avant-garde exchanges staged between words and images, beginning with the appearance of stenciled letters and pasted paper cutouts from newspapers, journals, and other sources introduced by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque as a leading aspect of the astonishing innovations of the Cubist movement they spearheaded between around 1908 and 1913, or the manifold experiments of the futurists and later Dada and Surrealist artists from the mid and later 10s through the 1930s. Here, the calligraphic inscriptions of Jaune Miro, or the counter-rational and negatively inflected descriptors posted on his paintings by René Magritte, several of which have become mantras for the word image compound, nowhere more so than in this work, The Treason of Images, inscribed, "This is not a pipe." Now, Brüggemann's practice makes it clear, however, that the paradigms and types of interaction between words and images established in the first third of the 20th century and adventurously or otherwise recapped and reframed thereafter still have a deep constitutional and signifying resonance. The systematic incorporation in synthetic cubism beginning in 1912 of written fragments of current affairs, advertisements, announcements, and other newspaper content, as well as their layout and design, fonts, columnation, headlines, bylines, etc., transformed pictorial space into a newly interactive zone in which media collided with, quote, pictorial or aesthetic marks, planes, facets, stipples on the one hand, and abstract intimations of the iconography of studio-located still life on the other, the latter also subject to radical reformulation. Now, crucial here is that the most fundamental aspects of these innovations have passed, I want to argue, quite directly into Brüggemann's paintings and installations, though in context-modified forms. He thus introduces references that allude, not, of course, to the Parisian newspapers circulating a century or more ago, such as Le Figaro and Le Journal, or ads and promotional copy for products sold in the great department stores of the French capital, as in this extraordinary work by Picasso, Au Bon Marché, from 1913, which incorporates text referring not just to the emporium after which it is titled, but also to a rival store across town, Samaritain. Instead, Brüggemann refers to the defining media outlets of the late 20th and 21st centuries, including CNN, an acronym familiar worldwide that unfolds into a veritable synopsis of one of the major social and technological reorganizations of media distribution, cable network news. Now, one of a series of gold leaf on canvas works made in the last few years, Brüggemann's 15th of January 2021 Washington, D.C. On Alert features the letters CNN spray-painted in three slightly ghosting colors, loosely aping the sans serif font of the media group's logo and on-screen self-representation. Accentuated by the triple application of red, white, and blue, and a slight curling and overextension of the rightmost vertical lines making up the two ends, the ragged appearance of the brand name marks an ambiguous pictorial difference between the hand-applied text and the more perfect resolution of the original corporate design. This announces and underscores a cascade of related defections from expected points of view, each predicated on a negative economy not dissimilar in certain respects to Magritte's dissenting captions. We see nothing of the commentary, interviews, opinion, or scrolling text that we immediately associate with cable news broadcasts, and nothing again of the flood of still and moving images that accompany and modify these language-activated registers. The imputed content of news programming is, in fact, entirely deferred to the title, which points to a particular day, 15th of January, 2021, a specific location, the US capital, Washington, D.C., and finally, to a condition or atmosphere notated by reference to the city being, quote, on alert. Although not set in the precise format associated with the TV news ticker, the chyron or crawler generally in motion along the bottom of a screen, the title effectively usurps this information-rich function, while the image with which it is sometimes associated, though often out of step, is reduced to a hand-rendered facsimile sprayed onto a golden ground, the refractions, sheen, and irregularities of which somehow both eclipse and stand in for the absent on-screen images and texts. So this work is part of a series of 8 paintings bearing dates and subtitles tracking events in the aftermath of the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the US Capitol, with the original intention being to produce one painting corresponding to each day. On one level, the aim was to distill the events churning through a given news cycle in formal, material, and mutely allegorical terms. So the tricolor accents of red, white, and blue emblematize the stars and stripes and the capitalist nationalism that it subtends, while the multiply articulated, slightly wavering hand-sprayed logo loosely suggests the improvisations of protest. The nature of the painted CNN is worth exploring just a little further. First, the letters are roughly centered in the painting and posed in its upper third so that they seem to function more like a headline than a ticker text. Secondly, the logo has been spray painted using commercially available canisters of paint in white and true primary colors. The mode of application takes us back to the activities of the historical avant-garde, although we need to track a number of somewhat indirect steps in order to trace this journey. Clearly, one allusion here is to graffiti, the action at a distance represented by the spraying, linked to one of the dominant technical formations associated with the adding of language to the often urban environment that represents a signal turn in the substrate of relations brokered between paint and text, the consequences and effect of which can be measured in relation to earlier method of hand-applied, quote, writing. Taking up with a method of language production associated with various youth and subcultures that had already been uneasily annexed by the art world in the gallery exhibited or exhibition-adjacent graffiti art of the 1970s and 80s, and then again contentiously reintegrated as style, we'll stay on this image, in the work of later generations. Brüggemann almost self-consciously underscores the stakes of sprayed language as it collides with the popular provision of news. At the same time, he puts into relief some of the implications of the move from an earlier regimen of supplemental text marks set out in the form of signatures, stenciled letters, and calligraphy to the sprayed-on language made possible by the mass production and accessibility of aerosol technologies after World War II, including Robert Abplanalp's invention at the end of the 40s of a crimp-on valve to facilitate the dispensing of gases under pressure, and the cost-effective alliance of aerosol innovation with the lightweight aluminium generally used for cans and containers. The patent, as you can see, followed on in 1953, and Ab Planalp used his colossal fortune to support Richard Nixon, both before, during, and after his presidency. Perhaps we're in a better position now to understand some of the modes of overlay and revision set out between earlier 20th century art-oriented inscription and later developments. Clearly, the role of the signature is rescored and amplified in graffiti by the tag. The sweep and rhythm of calligraphy or handwriting are recast and rescaled historically in the marking of walls, of subway cars, trains, and other available flattish surfaces. In more general terms, touch has given way to actions that originate remotely in relation to the host surface as a mode of airborne delivery. And in terms of instrumentation or apparatus, the point and the nib have been replaced by the nozzle. Now, a further continuity in the articulation of word-image relations by the historical avant-garde and in postmodern practice, and now in the work of Brüggemann, turns on the central innovation of synthetic cubism, collage itself. Many of the formal inventions of surrealist, neo-avant-garde, conceptual, post-conceptual practice developed different modes of simulation of the physical pasted papers used in early collage. Key examples are the image juxtapositions of Magritte, which we've seen, also of Salvador Dali, and later of James Rosenquist. Joseph Kossuth's deployment of contiguous categories cut out from Roget's Thesaurus in the second investigation, in which collage is run in reverse as the entries were translated into copy-ready advertisements and sent on to be republished in newspapers and journals, or on billboards, as here there's one in Pasadena. Or the cut and paste designs that structure the layouts of Kruger's phototext works. But if, on occasion, Brüggemann too simulates the appearance of collage, he also, I think, negotiates with the technique quite directly. This proximity is most obvious, perhaps, in the second iteration of high-speed contrast, in which 10 large rectangular sheets of dye bond, an aluminum composite material, or ACM, are literally glued to the walls as part of an elaborate three-dimensional collage. In its initial form, high-speed contrast comprised digitally generated but mostly illegible images in which text was added using Photoshop, then printed on a dye-bond surface that was also subject to what the artist describes as, quote, some minimal gestures with spray paint, end quote. The version presented in an abandoned late modernist structure dramatically sited on the Spanish island of Ibiza used the same images but printed them on wallpaper-type supports glued directly to the wall. The show was staged in an unfinished hotel and resort complex in the Cala d'en Serra in northern Ibiza, commenced in 1969 by the Catalan modernist Josep Lluís Sert, but abandoned in the mid-1970s while Sert was in exile in the US following pressure from the Franco regime. In this context, the paper prints were disposed as a kind of graffiti pasted up without permission on top of the tags and graffiti already in situ. The present exhibition presents the latest iteration in this room of high-speed contrast, once again deploying the same images printed on dye bond, but with the printed text now rendered in gold leaf, along with a regimen of distinctive, sometimes cursive, sometimes word-like marks made with red spray paint. In each iteration, however, the founding images are details taken from the huge cacophonous mirror mural created by Brüggemann in his Mexico City studio, Headlines and Last Lines in the Movies, 2019. Now, leaving aside the serendipitous but intriguing similarity between the cube-like compartments of the Sert hotel buildings and the cubic houses in Braque's Les Stacks landscapes of 1908 that actually gave rise to the name of the Cubist movement, following a review by Louis Vaucel later that year, the issues addressed by Brüggemann echo and reframe some of the central concerns of the synthetic revolution. Two, I think, stand out: the investigation of scale and the slicing up of language. Brüggemann's pasted dye-bond photographs arise expressly from an etiquette of what he terms excessive enlargement, coupled with courses of transfer from one digital device to another, in order to interrogate the technological artifice of distortion and relays of scale, and to contend with the auratic authenticity of the image. Now, while little attention, I think, has been paid to some of these questions in the copious literature on Cubist collage, they are, in fact, quite central to the experiments of Picasso and Braque during the half-decade beginning in 1912. If their introduction of cut-up fragments from newspapers into the pictorial domain was, of necessity, conducted in a one-to-one scale of equivalence, as paper excerpts were simply cut from their original context and carefully relocated onto a canvas or other support, the typeset words were subject to several scale-related contingencies. First, the transfer incorporated an intrinsic hierarchical sizing in that the relocated material featured different scales and modes of text: headlines, subtitles, text boxes, ad as opposed to news copy, etc. Second, and more elusively, the at-hand scale of pasted newspaper fragments entered into a set of size-determined relations with the other elements of a given composition. In Au Bon Marché, for example, one of the collaged newspaper cutouts features the graphically simplified head and shoulders of a woman whose real scale is diminutive not only in relation to the adjacent text, but also to the diagrammatic glass on the right and the bottle or decanter on the left, which are themselves presented at discrepant scales. In most of the early collages, in fact, we encounter a blizzard of discordant sizings and scales that anticipates quite precisely the more programmatic pursuit of scalar dissimulation by Brüggemann over a century later. Now, the dialogue presented by the splitting up of words is even more direct and consequential, I think. In each case, Brüggemann overlays his distorted enlargements, which, like a good deal of the equally but differently distorted iconography of Cubist collages, remains, quote, indecipherable, with 3 or 4 lines of aphoristic text rendered in a bold sans serif font. I've extracted them for you on screen here. The 10 split propositions were generated according to a complex routine of severance techniques. For example, 6, isolate a single letter from the end of a longer word. 7, feature 2 words with 2 or 3 splits. 3, have 3 words. And only 1, self on time, which announces its own punctual appearance, features words that remain unbroken. Now, there are many ways we can attempt to understand these cut-up, superimposed texts, both on their own terms and in mutual relation as stanzas of a sort within a crypto-poetic whole. For a start, the writings derive from the language-suffused atmospheres in which Brüggemann lives and works. Words and phrases are drawn in and noted down somewhat, quote, unconsciously from what I absorb, from what I'm hearing in the news, on TV, on YouTube, on the radio. They are threaded through the music the artist plays or hears in his studio and enmeshed in a more consolidated intervention in the form of a longer poem of sorts, on screen here, Beats per Minute from 2017, referred to by the artist as an extended quotation, but one that might have been appropriated from multiple sources, part William Burroughs cut-up, part concrete poem, part uncreative writing. In all these modes of appearance and negotiation, snippets of found language are compressed, layered, and sped up in an unsystematic, open-form process that distresses both the context and the meaning. So how can we make sense of the form, appearance, messaging, and wider signification of these writings? One orientation might be around various experiences associated with selfhood, including two glosses on the idea of, quote, self-denial, one correlated with immersion, the other with expression, set in the context just noted of that punctual self who arrives or simply is on time. Two of the text clusters address speed or rapidity. Several speak to reduction or delimitation, others to permissive resolve, an allowed action, or something that might be, quote, instantly free, end quote. And then, in enunciative terms, the text clearly, if variously, announce, resolve, invoke, or report. The propositional matrix laid down here would be elusive, I think, even if the texts were delivered in quotes whole. But by splitting and splicing words and the spaces between them and drawing out 3 or 4 word clusters or phrases into 3 or 4 vertically stacked segments, allusion is brought into contact with the imponderable, with contradiction even. But one thing is reasonably clear. Brüggemann has followed and complicated some of the protocols of cutting up and splitting text that were developed so presciently in 1912 and 1913. If we return once more to Au Bon Marché, these continuities and recurrences are readily apparent. To begin with, the collage is formed of 4 blocks of text. Part of an advertisement for the Samaritaine department store is at the top. An ad for lingerie displayed with fancy calligraphic text is in the center of the work. Another pasted column of text underneath the bottle at the left side. And then in the lower center, there's a section of cutout text that has surely furnished a model, even if an unconscious one, for the stacking and splitting of the series in this room, high-speed contrast. Activating his prurient imagination, Picasso overloaded the Samaritaine female figure and the reference to female underwear below it by extracting and pasting in letters and word parts in 2 cut-out segments glued into a kind of white void or frame that makes them stand out as a caption or commentary on the juxtaposition above. Picasso's carefully excised text, like many of Brüggemann's, makes up a 4-ply column. The first 3 lines are comprised by l'un, L-U-N, in italics, likely the first part of lundi, or Monday in French, but possibly in dialogue with L'-U-N, l'un, meaning one of the something. There is a large capital B. There is the word trou, T-R-O-U, which could be the standalone French word for hole, or the first part of a longer word, such as trouvé or found. The smallest snippet of paper pasted at an angle below to match the diagonal lean of this two-step addition is also subdivided. At the top right are 5 horizontal lines that mimic and support the stacked arrangement of the letter-bearing cutouts, while below these, in capital letters, but employing a thinner font, we read I-C-E, ice in English, not the same in French, a word with which Brüggemann has actually engaged elsewhere in his work. Now, what precisely Picasso is pointing to with these manicured additions has been the subject of much conjecture. The word trou, hole, for example, might be a vulgar and anatomically misbegotten male locker room joke taking off from the lingerie ads and gendered orientations of the other pasted editions. Picasso indulged in numerous other typographical plays. The top cross-stroke of the capital T has been cut so that it looks like an F without its middle horizontal stroke, creating a non-word conundrum. And the horizontal bars of the E in ice, I-C-E, are also partly severed, so that this word is halfway to ici, I-C-I, the French indicative or shifter meaning here. As you can see, looking at just 2 examples, right? The Au Bon Marché, Collage by Picasso, and Exclusive Context, one of the works in this room, the cut-up scenes they broker and weave swerve in a force field of relations. Picasso's mélange of typographic differences meets Brüggemann's nested overwriting of reproductions. Both artists, somewhat dramatically, isolate single letters from longer words, although Picasso presents only the resulting fragments. Brüggemann posts all of his chosen words, but in opaquely legible split forms. And both divide their stacks of letters or part words with lines. Brüggemann with a horizontal mark presented as a motif in the last phase of his serial reproductions, Picasso with a grid of 5 horizontal lines, as you can see, that probably derived from his source material, but at the same time resemble some of the supplemental marks, planes, staves, scaffolding, etc., characteristic of early Cubist collage. The broken texts of high-speed contrast represent, of course, just one moment in Brüggemann's career when he redeploys collage techniques. Perhaps his most extended dialogue with this paradigmatic modernist technique has been played out in a sequence of works that feature text-bearing additions in the form of letraset, vinyl letters, text-imprinted wallpaper, and other commercial or commissioned lettering products. These are, of course, themselves updates, personalized redirections, template variants of the print cultures and artisanal decorative devices that were annexed by Picasso and Braque, Braque's father being in the decoration business. Stuck-on letters and words appear not only in some of Brüggemann's gold ground paintings, but also in the artist's joke works. The beats per minute paintings feature machine-cut vinyl words applied by hand to the painted ground. His cartoon paintings use canvas or mirror as surfaces for dense arrays of inkjet prints of Ad Reinhardt's tartly satirical cartoon, What Do You Represent?, first published in the leftist magazine PM in 1946, and this image, finally, on screen, from the installation series Conceptual Decoration, has a custom-fit silver wallpaper printed with columns of text in small caps that repeat the title, Conceptual Decoration, from ceiling to floor. Elsewhere, Brüggemann uses the collage-like silkscreen process to add text to various works on mirrored surfaces, including A Symbol in Art is a Symbol from 2012, and here a panel from the first exhibition of headlines and last lines in the movies, which was shown at the Yvon Lambert Gallery in 2010 in New York City. So by way of a conclusion, I want to suggest that there is more at stake in these technical reprises of collage than just a tour de force accumulation of replays and variants, or a set of striking parallels and echoes. In fact, the questions that emerge from the collisions and collusions of collage are central to Brüggemann's larger inquiry, as attested by the final remark of the artist's voiceover for a video review that he made of his 2016 exhibition at Hauser Wirth in New York, which ends with the suggestion that, quote, "we become like a collage." Collage here is not a technical operation or an art world trope, but rather almost an existential similitude in which human experience, mediated by words and their interactive appearances, are understood as becomings, founded on overlay and mutual inscription. Related possibilities are clearly underscored in Brüggemann's most ambitious works, such as hyperpalimpsest, which overlay, open up, and redisperse several earlier projects. The artist's notes for hyperpalimpsest underline the importance of his interest in fundamental processes of layering, and ponder how it functions as a correlative to the unfettered accumulation of information in the digital age. The work also furnishes a more persuasive example of Brüggemann's extrapolation of collage into the three or more dimensions of installation and its spin-off virtual spaces. Now, while Picasso and Braque certainly associated collage with multiples and multiplicity, many cutouts, numerous fonts, different scales, an echo chamber of references and allusions, insider, prankster, misogynist on the one hand, personal, sexual, political on the other, and almost endlessly variegated replays between found materials and hand-applied marks, Brüggemann is responding to an altogether different context, emerging from the acceleration and explosion of mega or hyper multiplicity, practices and imaginations at the intersection of social life and reproduction, where copy, number, and appearance blur together vertiginously. That the results of this conjunction may be shattering or blinding is attested by after effects to which the artist bears specific witness, pointing to a finality he terms, quote, obliteration. The potentially destructive outcome signaled by practices that might end in obliteration has a correlate in the post-Cubist destiny of collage, as the technique was taken up and modified, especially by the Dada-affiliated artists working in Germany in the aftermath of World War I. Kurt Schwitters amplified the language of collage in works such as this one, Das Unbild, the and picture, from 1919, and emphasized its capacity for an almost unending chain of expansions, and plus and into infinity. Schwitters himself referred to the utter destruction of the war, noting that everything had broken down and new things had to be made from the fragments. Critics and art historians such as Karl Eisenstein and Otto Grautow raised the stakes of this claim, the latter developing the concept of Formzertrümmerung, or in German roughly, the destruction of form, and asserting that, quote, the present time recognizes as its goal the destruction of the existing order. In the context of nuclear proliferation, accelerating climate change, ecological degradation, and the recent viral pandemic, Brüggemann might well have sought to locate his ideas about obliteration in contemporary global social and political contexts, or to have modeled or correlated their appearance on or with these eventuations. That he has not done this, explicitly at least, offers another form of separation between his work and the historical and neo-avant-gardes. For Brüggemann, the effects of obliteration, as manifested, say, in a reproduction that is reproduced until it is thoroughly absent, or a certain voice declaiming texts that have erstwhile been written, or in the redolently ambient transcription of texts encountered on traditional or social media, these are neither responses to nor symptoms of social and political malaise, nor are they merely, I think, reflections of it. Instead, the artist articulates what the critic Mathieu Copeland terms thoughts on nothingness, void, and absence, within an envelope of materializations, contexts, and provisos that establishes its own modes of notation. The signifying space thus connoted is saliently non-allegorical, something present here, whether reduced, dissipated, or enunciated, does not stand in, easily at any rate, for something else, let alone for a referent that is morally inflected or reaches for portents of political revelation, which is not to say that Brüggemann refuses to model his responses after moral binaries, including truth and falsehood, the percussive and pernicious ambiguity between which has become one of the hallmarks of the current world order. Thank you. On that note of the current world order, rather portentous, Hernan will join us.
Okay, hi, hello, thank you for Hauser Wirth for having me. I guess the one in the completely amateur voice to counterbalance your expertise. I'm an architect by training, so this could be a dissertation about neurosurgery, and my knowledge will be more or less the same. But there is a couple, fantastic analysis and fantastic historical context. You reveal a couple of things to me that it was interesting. Like I never heard, or at least I never pay attention to the association of cubism and language. I think to me that produced a very interesting take. But to get I don't know how many words, no pun intended, I wrote. But there is one that, because it fascinates me, because I think it's one of the most, at least contemporary discussion in relation of mediums, the validity and the relevance still of the notion of collage. And if collage really, when you start to overlap, like for example, in the pieces in this room, we technically are collage, right? But I also will talk about layering. And the notion when it's unclear to read which one's supposed to be in focus, because at first glance one will think the gold font are the one in focus, but then you look, there is another series of words behind, and there's a graffiti behind, and a distinction between the graffiti and the typology. So maybe to get it going, it's maybe, do you make a distinction between the notion of, the historical notion of collage, the case of Picasso and Break is clear, and maybe in the work of Brüggemann, at least some of this work to me is more about layering than collage in the traditional sense, and that maybe had to do with the mediums that we operate, and the digital platforms. I'm pretty sure he's using a lot of digital productions and so on, but nevertheless, there is an aesthetic of digital that come up, which I think it works more on layering than collage. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or maybe to start somewhere.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's coming off of the remarks I made, I think that's absolutely a perfect first question, because yes, I think we have to signal a number of differences as well as a number of similarities. You've seen the similarities. I guess I haven't much more to say on that side. But I think there are a number of strategic differences, or between collage and what successive generations of first modernist, then avant-garde, then postmodernist artists were doing with the inheritance of that technique. And again, I showed a few works that moved from Dada and Surrealism up through some of the collage-like juxtapositions we see in pop art, particularly in Rosenquist, most obviously in Rosenquist, but not exclusively there, and then taken on again and redefined by some of the text artists from working in New York from the late 70s through the end of the 80s or the beginning of the 90s, particularly Barbara Kruger. There is, I think, something that shifted here that, for me, Brüggemann accentuates. I feel that many of those practices are more in continuity with historical cubism and with the notion of collage in quite simple, material, formal ways than Brüggemann. And to me, I was thinking, it's funny, I was thinking about this in the car on the way over. I was like, I've already anticipated this question. I was thinking, what is that difference? What is it that Brüggemann brings to this superficially similar language of collage that takes us in a different direction? And I think it's to do with temporality. I think it's, in that example I showed from Kurt Schwitters, right, the Und-Bild, where you have, what we would say technically in the academic world, you have a parataxis, right? And, things that are just extending in this additive line, things just being added in. Brüggemann has not returned to that scene of collage, right? He's returned, exactly as you say, to the palimpsest, to the superimposition and overlay of elements, one on top of the other, in a sort of giddy accumulation, right? We used to say the writing is on the wall, right? Some kind of premonition or signal that something is at stake, something is going to be developed. With Brüggemann, the writing is not on the wall, right? As you could argue it is with graffiti. The writing is in the wall, right? And it's actually a sort of epiphenomenon of the material constitution of the thing that a wall does, right? To separate or to articulate or to build up or to build out or whatever it might be. And for me, the stakes of this are temporal, because what Brüggemann has done is to superimpose chronological, temporal orders of statement or enunciation, of being, of experience, so densely one on top of the other that you get this kind of, this sort of mise en abîme, this place where spatiality is completely confounded by the temporality that has momentarily articulated it. And I think Brüggemann's very good at that. It isn't just a case of a guy wandering around with headphones and getting, now a bit of music, now something from CNN, now a social broadcast, now a podcast, now, whatever it might be, coming at him fragmentarily with the TV being on in the background and a conversation with a friend or a partner or a studio worker going on at the same time. 20, 30, 50 things superimposed one on top of the other. I think it begins with that, right? But he's moved that experience that we all have, that, you read any blog or any journalistic account of, the fading of attention in our contemporary times, and they begin with those predicates. I think what Brüggemann has actually managed to do is to find a way to dwell on and in the circumstance of that temporal suspension, how time itself is momentarily put on hold by something. And I think that ties back to the putting on hold of the social and the political, which I was trying to work through. Because I wanted to answer the question, it may be another question, of what is at stake in this work? What is at stake socially in this work? What is at stake in the references to graffiti, which is a subculture, youth, gang activity that has an entirely different sociological, historical context to the one that Brüggemann brings to it. What is at stake in all of those moves? And I find at the end of the day that it's quite philosophical. It actually is a reflection on the superimposed temporality that we are subject to.
I mean, the issue of temporality to me is, it's an interesting one. And I was thinking, I was writing some of the words of Brüggemann words, which seems to be like any artist who use words have to have. Like everybody uses the word sex, power, political, fear. They all seem words that keep popping up, at least in the last 40 years, any artist. Like, it's kind of interesting that there is a certain, I don't know if because certain words have more durability than others.
Yeah.
And the art have to do, but that's not really here. The other thing which I find interesting in relation to the words and so on, and I don't know if there is a direct correlation there, but it's fascinating too to see in a very contemporary artist, like I would consider him to be, there is a correlation also with things that we see and trends in fashion. Like, somebody like Virgil Abloh use words to differentiate products, and they do layers. He take any regular Nike and put a text on it, and by doing that, it became a much exclusive thing and so on, and some kind of a statement, or Supreme, or many other things that are coming into play. So there is something interesting that in an era we're supposed to be bombarded by media, by images, some of the most powerful mechanisms still is the manipulation of words and how we put it on pre-existing pieces. I would not argue that what he has is pre-existing. I think there is layers and so on, but one could argue, say, okay, he's using graffiti in a very, convention is the wrong word, but it looks like graffiti. And then he put things on top. So there is something interesting about this idea of appropriation of the ready-made, if you will, but just putting words on top. And to me, that's, I think, is a fundamental difference if we look at the historical context with some of the early examples and you were looking for it. There was, I don't know, like when I look at the work of Picasso and Brecht, it seems to have a much bigger distance with, let's say, with a more mainstream commercialization of messages. But this one seems to be much more familiar with the zeitgeist of things that we do. And I say that as a compliment to the work, not as a criticism. That maybe have to do with the social political agenda, which is to say, this work belongs to what we know.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the first part of what you said, I really agree with, and I think we could take that further, which is to say, we're used, when we're looking at, classical New York postmodern uses of words in caption-like formats. I keep citing Barbara Kruger, but it's not the only example. You see it in Holz's work. You see it in, I think, at least the later developments within the conceptual art movement, so the things that didn't happen in sort of the 68 to 72 period, but immediately afterwards. What you see is the sort of colonization of fragrant, politically charged text with the words use, power, control, et cetera, being signposted in a way I think that, as we look back on it, could seem even a little reductive, right? And certainly could seem over-directed to a certain extent. I mean, what interests me as we look around the words here is what the strange register they have. I mean, some of it's very banal. Speed limit. Here in LA, this is something that we encounter every single minute. Allow action, self-denial, self on time. I tried to go through some of the the many constellations of possibilities of how we could kind of attend to the semantics of these clusters, stuff around selfhood, stuff around offering a kind of injunction that isn't like a political injunction. It's just an everyday injunction. It's something that you just may hear or overhear just in a radio fragment or whatever it might be. And I don't know, I'm thinking that there's something quite powerful in that, precisely because its predicate isn't power, right? It's something, it makes you slip into the work and attend to its layering and its superimpositions and the nature of the speech, whether that speech is socially inflected, whether it's just everyday, whether it's throwaway. But in fact, it's all of those things. I mean, we could go through the speech or the writing presented as declarative speech in the works in this room, and we would find a few things that we could construe as political. We would find some things that were banal. We would find things that were common or everyday. We would find things that are a bit unusual, even poetic. And I think that's one of the strengths, right? That we've got 4 or 6 different formations of the experience of language as it is already circulated in our social environment. And I think that's probably the key difference with what's happening in the earlier 20th century, because to a certain extent, Picasso and Braque, they go to newspapers, right, which is a ready-made, right? They take a snippet, they're interested in a certain word, a certain article. Picasso had a prurient imagination, so the kinds of things he chose were really almost perverse, and deliberately so. Like there's an extract on venereal disease that he takes from a Catalan newspaper and pastes into one of his works. In a more self-referring way, he takes a text on an oculist, right, an eye doctor, because of course Cubism is charged with fooling the eye and producing the kind of medical eyesight-based improbability around perspective that was very challenging for its early audience in 1912. And he does all that. It's really clever and it's really playful, but it's always, he's absconded with text as a ready-made. Whereas what Brüggemann has done is partly to absorb, of course he's appropriated too, but he's partly absorbed this, he's partly replayed it, he's partly kind of, it is a playback mechanism to a certain extent, and then he's produced a sort of ambience, which is the setup of the series as a whole, in which we're sort of forced, as we are when we go through the pages of a book or we look at one thing after another thing, to try to make sense of this semantically as a succession or as a series of juxtapositions, or however, we've got many reading protocols that we could bring to this. But we try, perhaps, as we look at the show, as we come into the room, to push further to get the sense from these texts. And I think it is the layering and the complexity of that effort that interests me here.
I have one more question, but maybe this is a good time to open up for people in the audience if they want to ask. I think there is a microphone coming your way.
Oh, no.
It's not that we are that many.
I saw the show a few months ago, or when it opened, so I'm trying to remember an impression I had. I think it was some works in this room right here, because I kind of zoomed in. And they were, I believe that they're on stone. Right, so like the use of that was very striking for me as an alternative kind of like substrate, or what it's used, and what using stone references, and then the mark making on the stone and that. And I was curious about that as sort of in the work, if it was being used as sort of a comment to permanence or impermanence and things like that. If there's a question in there, or do you have a comment about the use of the stone?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good observation. And the works in the room behind us here, they're called the eroded series, or the eroded paintings. And I think it's some of the things that Brüggemann has done are quite obvious. You've alluded to them. He's used the substrate of marble, which which has this high aesthetic value, right? This is the stone of high art practice. But he's used it as a slab, as a surface, not as as the material for a sculptural articulation. And I think he's also, entering into a dialogue with the condition of the stone itself as something that is veined, or we actually use the term marbled, right? Of marble. It's one of those. Brüggemann would like that because it's a sort of semantic palimpsest. There's one thing. The material is laid over its own definition, right? To account for its own property, right? The marble is marbled. The marble is veined. And I think that's one of the ways in which he's coming at this greater question of erosion, right? I mean, and I think that goes back to what was being said here by Hernan, that one of the stakes in this is that the language inherited is already eroded. It's already worn down. Maybe not worn flat, but it's worn through. It's not worn out either, right? It's, you could sort of see how Brüggemann has occupied a space where he's not reacting to the extremes within that contention, right? There's something that remains. But what remains within the process that is ongoing about friction, subtraction, and the kind of the demolition of meaning, which is, I think, with this term obliteration that I ended with and tried to make some social and political correlations with the scene in the early 20th century. That's, I think, the final stakes of this, that we're using language as a set of tokens that are, in fact, ushering in our own forms of obliteration.
There's a well-known artist here in LA, Barbara Kruger, who also uses words. I'm sure you're very familiar with her. And as I was sitting and listening to you and seeing the art, I was just contrasting the two. I mean, her approach is very focused on the word. She tries to make it very direct. You can see it from the end of the room, what she's trying to convey. And the second thing is, I always associate her very specifically with a particular geography, which is LA. And with Brüggemann, I mean, he divides his time between London, Mexico City, and all that. I was wondering if that changes the kind of things you write about on your scripts, because politics are universal, but also very local. And so those are the two things. One was the aesthetic of how they put the words on the canvas, and the other is the kinds of words that end up on their canvases. So I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question. Thanks for it. It's funny, when I didn't know Stefan Brüggemann's work when I was asked, someone in Britain asked me to write something for a show. And I'd heard of Stefan's work, maybe I'd seen a few things. I really didn't know it. And I certainly didn't know him. And I made a set of assumptions at the beginning of my journey through that research. I had no idea that Stefan came from Mexico City, right, originally, and which is where he keeps the studio. He comes from Mexico City, and I have to say, I mean, there's a lot more to say on this subject to respond to your question, but it's become apparent to me over the course of trying to unpack and understand what's going on in the work that that's quite important. And that some of the things I'm trying to speak to may be possible in part because of, I wouldn't say wholly, but in part because of that context. And that his use of language, use of language that cycled through English as a second language in some senses, although he's absolutely fluent in English, the kinds of contexts that come from a non-American or non-Western European point of view. I do think that contributes, though I don't want to be reductive and determinist about it. I just think there's something there. But actually, you could help us with this.
I will say one thing. I've been in the States for 25 years, and I have an accent, but my brain operates in English, but there is a distance in the meaning of the word in English to me than in Spanish. Like, to me, to say bad words in English don't mean much. Sometimes I have to remember in front of my kids. If I say fuck in front of my kids, doesn't mean the same if I say something similar in Spanish. It doesn't have the same emotional connotation. And to me, that's an interesting thing about the work of him, that he chose to operate in English. I don't know, we will have to ask him if there is a necessity of creating emotional distance with the words, or it will mean the same, or he will choose the same words in Spanish.
Yep.
I mean, most of the words are fairly conventional words in Spanish. There's not that many words that you will say, oh, they don't exist in Spanish. They're there. But I think that's an interesting thing. I think there is a component of that is unavoidable. And by the way, it's true.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I showed 3 or 4 of her works in the talk. Yeah.
Maybe a couple more, and if somebody can think about it. I think we're still in the time frame. We're right. But a couple of things for you that it's about this show, but also I think it's beyond that show. One, as a designer, I'm incredibly bothered by the thing that the words are all in the center, because I hate symmetry. But I find that interesting that everything behind is not symmetrical, and there is a desire, so it's more like a comment, it's not that important. But the other thing which you were talking about the work, and I was thinking many months ago, in '98, there was a big retrospective of Mark Rothko and the Whitney, what it was at the time, Whitney. And I remember that I never been so interested in Rothko, but one of my professors said, go and see it, because when you see 50 Rothko next to each other, it totally makes sense. If you see one at a time, it doesn't make that much sense. And I have the feeling with some of these pieces, is that the case or not? If each of these pieces by itself, like whoever ended buying one of those pieces, you put it in your house or in your gallery, doesn't mean the same. That doesn't have the same weight, or not. I mean, for sure it will be different, but do you think there is something to that?
Yeah, just quickly on the first part of your question, or your comment, which was fantastic, because for the art world, right, this is really unsymmetrical, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember I went through with Stefan, and I remember that, one of the first things he said when we came into this room was how he tried to break down the symmetry. But I see exactly what you mean, because he's done it in one dimension, but in many other dimensions from a design point of view, that hasn't happened. So I think that's right. And then on this, I think I would just take your point and push it further, because I think it's not only, for me anyway, it's not only the case that I would want to try to come to terms with the works here, with the 8-9 works in this room as, maybe not a sequence, but as an ensemble, right? As a choric collection of texts and images and spaces between that also come in relation, as you usefully pointed out, with this, this slightly strange and, in relation to the other text, even off-putting slogan that's been put on the wall above us. I would not only want to read these together and with this, but I've come to understand that I think, probably the best reading of Brüggemann's work is to read the whole series of textual interventions as a kind of encyclopedia of these analyses, and that's where the strength of the work, I think, probably lies. At
Like
least
a glossary.
Yeah. Well, maybe not a glossary, but it's maybe a big book of poems. It's an anthology. I feel this is an anthology work at that level. As you sometimes don't feel. Maybe it's true of Rothko. I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, to go to your question, is it true of Kruger? I mean, would one want to say that of the cumulative politics and strong feminist consciousness that we see in Barbara Kruger's works? Would we want to go beyond the unitary slogan, oh, that just addresses this? I think we would, actually. I think that's probably a strength of her work as well. Is that true of a conceptual artist like, say, Joseph Kossuth or Robert Barry, some of the examples I showed earlier? I'm not sure it is. And that might be a defining difference here.
But I will say in his particular work, another one, I think like a recurrent obsession with something, to me, that's something very valuable in the work of an artist. At least the one I tend to gravitate towards are those that they tend to produce that kind of work. There is a, I will call it productive obsession of relentlessness, which I think my feeling is that Brüggemann has that.
Yes.
And to me, that's, I'm intrigued to see where the world will come after. I mean, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, many of the artists that use words, eventually they walk away a little bit, not all of them, but the majority, and they move into something else. So I'm curious to see if that's something that he will do or not moving forward. So, but again, that's just a pure speculation, and it's more like a curiosity to see what comes next.
Yeah, it's a relentlessness with the stakes of language rather than the relentless pursuit of language idioms or language examples or statements or poems or whatever it would be, as conceived of as individual articulations. It's the stakes of language. So I think that you got us to the place where we needed to be at the end here.
I think on my end is just to thank John for a fantastic presentation and a very illuminating one. And it's always fantastic to hear to people who truly understand history and they connect. It's a good reminder that actually we are in a perennial Moebius strip. Like every time that we think that something is new, it's not really that new. And when we think something is old, it's not really that old. And it's a reminder again that Picasso is like the Beatles. Everything goes back to it. I mean, you can trade everything in contemporary music and you're gonna find the Beatles and Muddy Waters and so on. And Picasso is the same. So I think we should thank John for an extraordinary afternoon. And on my end, that's all. I don't know, John, you want to say something else?
Well, just to thank you, Hernan, and the audience for these great questions.